Sarah Martinez had been working at Miller's Diner for exactly 18 months, and in all that time, she had never spoken more than 10 words to any customer. The regulars knew her routine by heart. She would approach their table with a notepad, point to the menu items she recommended with a gentle smile, and somehow manage to take their complete order without saying a single word. Her movements were precise, almost military in nature, and she had an uncanny ability to anticipate exactly what each customer needed before they even realized it themselves. The diner sat on the corner of Maple Street and Fifth Avenue, a classic American establishment, with red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and the constant aroma of coffee and bacon grease hanging in the air. It had been serving the small town of Millbrook for over 40 years, and most of its customers were locals who had been coming there since they were children. Sarah fit into this familiar landscape like she had always belonged there, despite the fact that nobody really knew anything about her past. What made Sarah particularly intriguing to the regular customers was not just her silence, but the way she carried herself. There was something different about her posture, the way she scanned the room when she entered, and how she always chose to stand with her back to the wall during her breaks. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the standard diner uniform of a white blouse and black skirt. But there was an alertness in her brown eyes that suggested she was constantly aware of everything happening around her. The tattoo on her left forearm usually remained hidden beneath her long sleeves, but occasionally, when she reached for something on a high shelf or wiped down a table with particular vigor, the fabric would slide up just enough to reveal a glimpse of dark ink. Most customers caught only fleeting glimpses and assumed it was probably just a flower or some decorative design, nothing particularly noteworthy in a world where tattoos had become commonplace. On this particular Tuesday morning in late October, the diner was busier than usual. A group of construction workers had stopped in for breakfast before heading to their job site. Several local business people were having their usual morning meetings over coffee and eggs, and a few retired veterans had claimed their regular corner booth where they gathered every Tuesday and Thursday to solve the world's problems over endless cups of black coffee. Among the veterans was Frank Morrison, a 72-year-old former Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and never quite adjusted to civilian life. Frank had sharp eyes despite his age, and he had been watching Sarah with growing curiosity for months. There was something about the way she moved that reminded him of soldiers he had known, a certain economy of motion and constant awareness that civilians simply didn't possess. Sitting with Frank were his longtime friends, Jimmy Rodriguez, who had served in the Army during the Gulf War, Tom Wilson, a Navy veteran who had spent most of his career on submarines, and Pete Hammond, who had been in the Air Force and still flew small planes as a hobby. These 4 men had formed an unlikely friendship based on their shared military experience and their need to gather regularly to process the world through the lens of their service. As Sarah approached their table with the coffee pot, Frank decided he had been curious long enough. She began filling their cups with the same efficient, silent routine she had performed hundreds of times before. But this time, Frank spoke up. "You know, miss," Frank said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had developed as a drill instructor, "I've been watching you work here for months, and I can't shake the feeling that you've got some military background. Am I right?" Sarah's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she poured Tom's coffee, but she didn't look up or respond. She simply continued with her task, moving to Pete's cup with the same measured precision. "Frank's got a point," Jimmy added, leaning back in his booth. "You've got that way about you. The way you stand, the way you scan the room. It's like you're always on guard duty." Tom nodded in agreement. "And you're definitely in better shape than most of the folks around here. I've seen you lift those heavy trays like they weigh nothing." Pete, who was usually the quietest of the group, surprised everyone by speaking up. "Plus, you've got that 1,000-yard stare sometimes. I've seen it in pilots who've been through some serious situations." Sarah finished pouring their coffee and was about to turn away when Frank gently reached out and touched her arm, just above the wrist. It was a gentle gesture meant to get her attention, but when his fingers made contact with her sleeve, he felt something beneath the fabric that made him pause. "What's that under there?" he asked, his voice softer now, more curious than demanding. For the first time since anyone could remember, Sarah actually stopped and looked directly at the 4 men. Her brown eyes moved from face to face, and they could see her weighing some internal decision. The diner continued its usual morning bustle around them, but at their corner booth, everything had gone quiet. After what felt like several minutes but was probably only about 30 seconds, Sarah set down the coffee pot and slowly rolled up her left sleeve. The tattoo that was revealed made all 4 veterans draw in sharp breaths simultaneously. The ink was professional, detailed, and unmistakably military. It showed a scope crosshair with precise measurement markings, surrounded by text that read Sniper Division in military-style lettering. Below that were numbers that the veterans immediately recognized as coordinates, and beneath the coordinates was a small banner with the words, "One shot, one kill." The silence at the table stretched out as each man processed what they were seeing. This wasn't some civilian's idea of a cool military tattoo. This was the real thing, the kind of tattoo that only someone who had actually served in a sniper unit would get. And not just any sniper unit, the level of detail and the specific elements included suggested someone who had been very good at their job. Frank was the first to find his voice, and when he spoke, it was with a respect that hadn't been there before. "How many tours?" he asked simply. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then held up 3 fingers. "Iraq or Afghanistan?" Jimmy asked quietly. She pointed to herself, then made a motion with both hands that they understood to mean both. Tom leaned forward, his submarine commander instincts kicking in. "What unit?" For the first time, Sarah spoke, her voice so quiet they had to strain to hear her. 3rd Battalion, 75th Rangers. The 4 men exchanged glances. They all knew what that meant. The 75th Ranger Regiment was one of the most elite units in the Army, and their 3rd Battalion had been heavily deployed during the height of operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. If Sarah had been a sniper with the Rangers, she had seen and done things that most people couldn't even imagine. "How many confirmed?" Pete asked, using the military terminology that they all understood. Sarah hesitated, then held up both hands, fingers spread. 10? Frank asked. She shook her head and repeated the gesture. 20? Jimmy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once, then rolled her sleeve back down and picked up the coffee pot as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The 4 veterans sat in stunned silence as Sarah walked away to attend to other customers. They had been coming to this diner for months, sharing space with someone who had been through experiences that made their own military service look routine by comparison. "Jesus Christ," Tom muttered under his breath. 20 confirmed kills. "Rangers," Pete said, shaking his head. "No wonder she moves like that." Frank was watching Sarah as she went about her work, seeing her now with completely different eyes. "You know what this means," he said to his friends. "She's not working here because she wants to be here. She's working here because she needs to be here. This is her way of trying to blend back into civilian life." "PTSD?" Jimmy asked. "Has to be," Frank replied. "You don't go from being a Ranger sniper to waiting tables in a small-town diner unless something went seriously wrong with your transition back home." They watched as Sarah continued her rounds, filling coffee cups and taking orders with the same silent efficiency she had always displayed. But now they understood that her silence wasn't just a quirk or a personality trait. It was likely a symptom of whatever she had experienced during her 3 deployments with one of the most elite and dangerous units in the military. "We need to do something," Tom said finally. "Like what?" Pete asked. "She's obviously not interested in talking about it." "Maybe that's exactly why we need to do something," Frank replied. "She's been carrying this alone for who knows how long. She's working in a diner, for God's sake. Someone with her skills and experience should be doing a lot better than this." "You don't know that," Jimmy warned. "Maybe this is exactly what she wants. Maybe she's happy here." "Happy?" Frank scoffed. "Look at her, Jimmy. Really look at her. Does she look happy to you?" They all turned to observe Sarah again. She was taking an order from a young family, using her usual system of pointing and nodding. But now that they knew what to look for, they could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly swept the room, and the careful way she positioned herself to keep all the exits in sight. "She's still on patrol," Tom observed. "Even here, even in the safest place in the world, she's still on patrol." "That's what I'm talking about," Frank said. "She needs help, and she probably doesn't even realize it. Or maybe she does realize it, but doesn't know how to ask for it." "So, what do you suggest?" Pete asked. Frank thought for a moment, watching as Sarah efficiently delivered the family's order and moved on to the next table. "We start small," he said finally. We let her know that she's not alone, that there are people here who understand what she's been through. And then what? Then we see if we can help her remember that she's not just a survivor, Frank said. She's a hero, and heroes deserve better than to be forgotten in a small-town diner. The morning rush began to slow down around 10 o'clock, and the 4 veterans found themselves still sitting in their corner booth, nursing their 4th or 5th cups of coffee and continuing to watch Sarah work. They had noticed things they had never seen before. The way she always kept her dominant hand free, how she unconsciously checked the positions of all the other employees, and the fact that she never, ever sat down during her entire shift. "You know what bothers me the most?" Jimmy said suddenly. "What's that?" "She's probably younger than my daughter. Rangers don't take just anybody. And they definitely don't make just anybody a sniper. She would have had to be exceptional. Absolutely exceptional to get that job. And she would have been just a kid when she did it." This observation sobered them all. They had been thinking of Sarah as a fellow veteran, someone who had shared similar experiences to their own. But the truth was that her experiences had been far more intense and traumatic than anything they had encountered, and she had endured them at an age when most people were just figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. "How old do you think she is now?" Tom asked. "Mid-20s, maybe," Frank guessed, which means she was probably 18 or 19 when she deployed the first time. "Christ," Pete muttered. 18 years old and carrying a sniper rifle in Baghdad or Kabul. They continued to watch as Sarah worked, and gradually they began to notice other customers' reactions to her. Most people seemed to accept her silence as just part of her personality, but there were a few who clearly found it off-putting. A businessman at table 6 kept trying to engage her in conversation, becoming increasingly frustrated when she didn't respond. A group of teenagers at the counter were making jokes about her, calling her the weird mute waitress, just loudly enough for her to hear. Sarah gave no indication that any of this bothered her, but the 4 veterans could see the way her jaw tightened slightly and how she moved a little faster to get away from the problematic customers. "This is bullshit," Frank said finally, his voice rising slightly. "These people have no idea who they're dealing with." "Easy, Frank," Tom warned. "Getting angry isn't going to help anything." "Maybe not, but somebody needs to stand up for her." "Maybe," Jimmy said thoughtfully, "what she needs isn't someone to stand up for her. Maybe what she needs is someone to remind her that she can stand up for herself." They were still discussing this when Sarah approached their table again, coffee pot in hand. She began to refill their cups, but Frank gently put his hand over his cup to stop her. "Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time, "we want you to know that we respect what you did over there, all of us. And if you ever want to talk, or if you ever need anything, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Same time, same table." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once before moving on to the next table. "Well," Tom said, "it's a start." "Yeah," Frank agreed, "it's a start." As they prepared to leave, Frank left a larger tip than usual and wrote a brief note on his napkin. "Thank you for your service. You're not alone." He placed it carefully under his coffee cup where Sarah would find it when she cleared the table. The 4 men walked out into the crisp October morning, each lost in his own thoughts about what they had learned and what they might do about it. Behind them, the diner continued its familiar rhythm, with Sarah moving silently through her duties, carrying secrets and experiences that set her apart from everyone around her. But for the first time in 18 months, she wasn't carrying them completely alone. Word traveled fast in Millbrook, especially when it involved something as extraordinary as discovering that the quiet waitress at Miller's Diner was actually a decorated Army Ranger sniper. By Thursday morning, when Frank, Jimmy, Tom, and Pete returned for their regular gathering, they found the atmosphere in the diner had shifted noticeably. Sarah was working her usual shift, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Several customers were stealing glances at her, whispering among themselves and pointing discreetly when they thought she wasn't looking. The 4 veterans took their customary corner booth and immediately noticed that Sarah seemed more guarded than usual, her movements slightly more rigid, and her scanning of the room more frequent. "This is exactly what I was worried about," Tom said quietly as they watched a middle-aged woman at table 3 crane her neck to get a better look at Sarah's arm, even though her sleeves were firmly in place. "People are treating her like some kind of circus attraction. It gets worse, Frank replied grimly. My neighbor told me that someone posted about it on Facebook yesterday. Apparently, the story has been shared all over town. Jimmy shook his head in disgust. Great. So much for respecting her privacy. They had hoped that their discovery would remain between them and Sarah, giving her the choice of when and how to share her story with others. Instead, it seemed like half the town now knew about her military background, and judging by the stares and whispers, not everyone was handling the information with the respect it deserved. When Sarah approached their table with coffee, she moved more quickly than usual, clearly wanting to minimize her exposure to their scrutiny. But before she could pour and leave, Frank spoke up. How are you holding up? He asked gently. For just a moment, Sarah's professional composure slipped, and they could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She shrugged slightly, a gesture that conveyed volumes about what the past 2 days had been like for her. People won't stop staring, she said quietly, surprising them by actually speaking without being asked a direct question. I know, Frank replied, and I'm sorry about that. We never intended for this to become public knowledge. Sarah nodded to indicate she understood it wasn't their fault, but her expression remained troubled. She finished pouring their coffee and was about to leave when a loud voice from across the diner made everyone turn. Hey, sniper girl! Called out a burly man in his 50s who was sitting at the counter. Is it true you killed 20 people? The entire diner went silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, coffee cups were set down, and every eye in the place turned toward Sarah. She froze in place, her back still turned to the man who had shouted, but the 4 veterans could see her shoulders tense up like coiled springs. That was completely inappropriate, Tom said loudly enough for everyone to hear, but the man at the counter wasn't finished. I'm just asking a question, the man said defensively. If she's some kind of war hero, why is she working in a diner? Seems like there's more to the story if you ask me. Sarah slowly turned around to face him, and for the first time since any of them had known her, there was something dangerous in her expression. The careful mask of pleasant customer service had dropped away, revealing the steel underneath. Nobody asked you, she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the silent diner. Well, excuse me, the man replied with a sneer. I just think if someone's going to go around bragging about how many people they killed, they should be prepared to talk about it. She wasn't bragging about anything, Frank said, standing up from his booth. She was answering questions from fellow veterans who had the right to ask them. Yeah, well, maybe some of us have questions too, the man shot back. Like why someone who's supposedly such a badass soldier is waiting tables in a small town. What happened couldn't hack it in the real world. The silence in the diner became oppressive. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, but the veterans could see her breathing had changed. She was using techniques they all recognized, ways of staying calm under extreme stress that were taught to soldiers in high-pressure situations. You need to stop talking, Jimmy said firmly, also rising from his seat. Or what? The man challenged, spinning around on his stool to face them. You old-timers going to protect your girlfriend there? That was the wrong thing to say. Pete, despite being the quietest member of their group, was also the one with the shortest temper when it came to disrespect. He was on his feet and moving toward the counter before anyone could stop him. Listen carefully, Pete said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded air crews in life-or-death situations. You're going to apologize to her, and then you're going to leave. Right now. The man at the counter was bigger than Pete, probably outweighing him by 50 pounds, but something in the veteran's eyes made him hesitate. I don't think I will, he said, but his bravado was starting to sound forced. Then we have a problem, Pete replied evenly. What happened next surprised everyone, most of all the 4 veterans. Sarah stepped forward, moving with fluid grace until she was standing between Pete and the troublemaker at the counter. It's okay, she said, looking directly at Pete. I can handle this. Then she turned to face the man who had been harassing her, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that commanded instant attention. You want to know what happened? She asked. You want to know why I'm working here instead of using my military training in some high-paying security job or law enforcement career? The man nodded. clearly not understanding that he was about to get more than he had bargained for. I'm working here because after 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, after watching friends die, after doing things that were necessary but that no civilian should ever have to understand, I needed to find a place where I could remember what it felt like to help people instead of hurt them. Her voice remained steady, but there was an intensity in her words that made everyone in the diner lean forward slightly. I'm working here because serving coffee and eggs to people in my hometown feels like a way to serve my community without carrying a weapon. I'm working here because the skills that made me a good sniper, patience, attention to detail, the ability to stay calm under pressure, also make me a good waitress. She took a step closer to the man, and he actually leaned back slightly. But mostly I'm working here because it's none of your damn business what I do with my life or why I do it. I served my country with honor, I did my job, and I earned the right to make my own choices about what comes next. And if you have a problem with that, then maybe you should examine why the sight of a veteran trying to rebuild her life in peace makes you so uncomfortable. The silence that followed was complete. No one in the diner moved or spoke for what felt like several minutes. The man at the counter had gone pale, clearly realizing that he had badly misjudged the situation. Finally, he cleared his throat and mumbled, I didn't mean any disrespect.
Yes, you did, Sarah replied calmly.
But I'm choosing to accept your apology anyway because that's the person I'm trying to be now. The man left money on the counter for his unfinished coffee and walked out without another word. As soon as the door closed behind him, conversations gradually resumed throughout the diner. Though everyone was still stealing glances at Sarah, she returned to the veteran's table and stood there for a moment, the adrenaline of confrontation slowly wearing off. That was well done, Frank said admiringly. Thanks, Sarah replied, then surprised them by actually sitting down in the empty spot next to Tom. Can I ask you guys something? Of course, Jimmy said. How do you do it? How do you live with people looking at you like you're either a hero or a monster, depending on their mood? The 4 men exchanged glances, recognizing the question as one they had all struggled with in their own ways. It gets easier, Tom said finally, but it never really goes away completely. The key is remembering that their opinions don't define who you are, Frank added. You know what you did and why you did it. That's what matters. But what if I'm not sure anymore? Sarah asked quietly. What if I can't remember why it all seemed so important at the time? This was the heart of it, the veterans realized. Sarah wasn't just dealing with the challenge of transitioning back to civilian life. She was dealing with a crisis of meaning, wondering if the sacrifices she had made and the things she had done had been worth it. Tell us about your unit, Pete said gently. What were your missions like? Sarah was quiet for so long that they thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant as if she was seeing something far away. We were part of operations to eliminate high-value targets, she said. Taliban commanders, bomb makers, people who were actively planning attacks on American forces and Afghan civilians. Every mission was carefully planned, thoroughly justified, and absolutely necessary. She paused, absently rubbing her tattooed forearm through her sleeve. I was good at it because I could see the bigger picture. Every shot I took potentially saved dozens of lives. American soldiers, Afghan allies, innocent civilians who would have been killed by the bombs these people were making. That sounds like meaningful work to me, Jimmy observed. It was, Sarah agreed. But that's not how it feels when you come home and people either want to thank you for your service without understanding what that service actually involved, or they want to judge you for doing things they could never imagine having to do. What about your family? Tom asked. What do they think? Sarah's expression darkened. My family thinks I should just get over it and move on with my life. They don't understand why I can't just use my military experience to get a good job in law enforcement or private security. They think I'm wasting my potential by working here. Are you? Frank asked directly. Sarah considered the question seriously. I don't know anymore. When I first got out, I tried the corporate security thing. I lasted 3 months before I had a panic attack during a meeting and ended up in the hospital. Then I tried working for a local police department, but I kept seeing threats that weren't there and treating routine traffic stops like combat situations. She looked around the diner, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of her workplace. This is the first place I've worked where I can make it through a full shift without feeling like I need to be constantly ready for a firefight. The work is simple, the customers are mostly predictable, and nobody expects me to make life or death decisions.
But is it enough? Pete asked. Is it fulfilling me? I don't know, Sarah admitted.
I don't know if I'm recovering or if I'm just hiding. I don't know if I'm healing or if I'm wasting my life. I don't know if working here is helping me remember how to be a normal person or if it's just enabling me to avoid dealing with my problems. The veterans absorbed this in silence.
The veterans absorbed this in silence.
They had all faced similar questions in their own transitions back to civilian life, but none of them had dealt with the level of intensity that Sarah had experienced. Maybe, Frank said thoughtfully, the question isn't whether you're hiding or recovering. Maybe the question is whether you're moving forward or staying stuck. What do you mean? Well, are you learning things about yourself here? Are you growing as a person? Are you building relationships and finding ways to contribute to your community? Sarah considered this. I guess I am in some ways. I've learned that I can be patient with difficult people. I've learned that I can find satisfaction in simple tasks done well. I've learned that I can be part of a team without being in a military unit. Those sound like important things to learn, Tom observed. But I've also learned that I still have nightmares every night, Sarah continued. I've learned that I can't handle unexpected loud noises without jumping out of my skin. I've learned that I don't know how to have normal relationships with people because I'm always expecting the worst. Have you talked to anyone about that? Jimmy asked. A counselor or therapist? Sarah shook her head. I tried the VA, but the waiting lists are months long, and when I finally got in, the counselor I was assigned to had never worked with combat veterans. She kept trying to relate my experiences to civilian trauma, which isn't the same thing at all. There are other options, Frank said. Private therapists who specialize in military trauma, support groups for veterans, programs specifically designed for people coming back from combat deployments. I know, Sarah replied. But most of them cost money I don't have, and the ones that are free usually have the same problems as the VA system. This was a frustrating reality that all of them understood. The civilian world was full of people who wanted to support our troops in theory, but the practical support systems for veterans transitioning back to civilian life were often inadequate or inaccessible. What if we helped you find something? Pete suggested. The four of us have been around long enough to know what resources are actually useful and which ones are just bureaucratic nonsense. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, and for the first time since they had known her, she seemed to be considering the possibility of accepting help. Why would you want to do that? She asked. Because, Frank said simply, you're one of us, and we take care of our own. 6 months had passed since that transformative Thursday morning when Sarah had finally opened up to the four veterans at Miller's Diner. What followed was a gradual but steady transformation that surprised everyone involved. Most of all, Sarah herself. True to their word, Frank, Jimmy, Tom, and Pete had spent considerable time and effort helping Sarah navigate the complex world of veteran support services. Pete, with his methodical Air Force background, had created a comprehensive spreadsheet of available resources, complete with contact information, eligibility requirements, and reviews from other veterans who had used the services. Tom had leveraged his connections from his submarine days to find Sarah a therapist who specialized in combat trauma and actually understood the unique challenges faced by women in elite military units. The breakthrough had come when Jimmy remembered a program run by a nonprofit organization that specifically helped special operations veterans transition to civilian careers. The program was funded by private donors and didn't have the bureaucratic obstacles that plagued government-run services. More importantly, it was run by veterans for veterans, which meant Sarah wouldn't have to explain basic concepts about military culture to people who had never served. Frank had been the one to convince Sarah to actually call the program. She had been hesitant, worried that seeking help would somehow diminish her reputation as a capable soldier. Frank had shared his own story about struggling with nightmares and hypervigilance after Vietnam, and how it had taken him nearly 20 years to realize that getting help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a continuation of the mission to serve. Your mission now, he had told her, is to become the best version of yourself that you can be. Everything else you did over there was about protecting and serving others. This is about protecting and serving the most important person in your life, you. The therapy sessions had been difficult at first. Sarah had spent so many years suppressing her emotions and focusing on the task at hand that learning to acknowledge and process her feelings felt like learning a foreign language. Rebecca Chen, her therapist, was a former Army medic who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan before becoming a clinical psychologist. She understood Sarah's experiences in ways that civilian therapists simply couldn't. Dr. Chen had explained that what Sarah was experiencing wasn't just PTSD, but something called moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone is forced to do things that conflict with their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong, even when those actions were necessary and justified. For snipers, who had to make split-second life-or-death decisions often based on incomplete information, moral injury was particularly common. "You're not broken," Dr. Chen had told Sarah during one of their early sessions. "You're injured, and like any injury, with proper treatment and time, you can heal." The healing process involved more than just therapy sessions. The nonprofit program had also connected Sarah with other special operations veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. She began attending monthly support group meetings where she could talk openly about her experiences without having to explain or justify them to people who hadn't been there. One of the most impactful connections she made was with Marcus Thompson, a former Navy SEAL who had struggled with similar challenges after leaving the military. Marcus had eventually started his own security consulting company and was looking for someone with Sarah's unique skill set to help train corporate executives in threat assessment and situational awareness. But real security is about prevention, not reaction. It's about seeing threats before they develop into problems. You have those skills in spades. The job Marcus offered wasn't anything like the high-stress corporate security position Sarah had tried before. Instead of being responsible for physically protecting people, she would be teaching business people how to protect themselves. The work involved conducting seminars on travel safety, workplace violence prevention, and personal security awareness. It was consulting work that allowed her to use her military experience in a way that felt constructive rather than destructive. What made the job particularly appealing was that it was primarily educational rather than operational. Sarah would be sharing knowledge rather than wielding weapons, teaching prevention rather than engaging in combat. It felt like a natural evolution of her military service. She was still protecting people, but in a completely different way. The transition hadn't been immediate. For several months, Sarah had continued working at the diner while gradually taking on more consulting work. This allowed her to build confidence in her new career while maintaining the stability and routine that had been so important to her recovery. The 4 veterans had been incredibly supportive throughout this process. They continued their regular Tuesday and Thursday morning gatherings at the diner, but now Sarah would sometimes join them during her breaks to discuss her progress and challenges. These conversations had evolved from simply talking about her problems to brainstorming solutions and celebrating successes. "The thing I'm proudest of," Sarah had told them during one such conversation, "is that I'm starting to feel like myself again. Not the person I was before I deployed, because that person doesn't exist anymore, but a version of myself that incorporates all of my experiences, military and civilian, into someone who can be useful in the world." The change in Sarah was visible to everyone who knew her. She still maintained the alertness and situational awareness that marked her as a veteran, but the constant tension had eased considerably. She smiled more often, engaged in longer conversations, and seemed genuinely interested in other people's lives rather than just politely tolerating them. Her work at the diner had also evolved. While she continued to prefer efficiency over small talk, she had begun to open up more with regular customers. People who had been curious about her military background found that she was willing to share appropriate stories about her service, though she maintained firm boundaries about what she would and wouldn't discuss. The incident with the rude customer months earlier had actually become something of a turning point for how the community viewed her. Word had spread about how she had handled the confrontation, with dignity, strength, and grace under pressure. People began to see her not as a curiosity or an oddity, but as someone who had made significant sacrifices for her country, and deserved respect and support as she rebuilt her life. This shift in community perception had led to several unexpected opportunities. The local high school had invited her to speak to students about military service and the importance of making thoughtful decisions about their futures. The police department had asked her to help with training officers in crisis de-escalation techniques. A women's self-defense class had requested her expertise in situational awareness and threat assessment. Each of these opportunities had helped Sarah recognize that her military experience wasn't something she needed to hide or apologize for, but rather a valuable set of skills and knowledge that could benefit others. She began to see herself not as damaged goods trying to blend into civilian society, but as someone with unique capabilities who could make meaningful contributions to her community. The most significant change, however, was in Sarah's relationship with her own service. Through therapy and the support of other veterans, she had been able to process the moral complexity of her combat experiences without losing sight of the larger purpose they had served. "I used to think about my 20 confirmed kills as 20 lives I had taken," she explained to Dr. Chen during one of their sessions. "But I've come to understand them as hundreds of lives I helped save. Every target I eliminated was someone who had been actively working to kill American soldiers and Afghan civilians. The math isn't perfect, and war is never clean, but the work I did mattered." This reframing hadn't eliminated all of Sarah's struggles. She still had difficult days and occasional nightmares, but it had given her a foundation of meaning that made those struggles more bearable. She had begun to see her current work as a continuation of her military service rather than a retreat from it. Marcus had been particularly insightful about this perspective. The best warriors, he had told her, aren't the ones who are good at fighting. They're the ones who understand that the ultimate goal of fighting is to create a world where fighting isn't necessary. Everything you're doing now, the therapy, the teaching, the community involvement, that's all part of the same mission. As spring arrived in Millbrook, Sarah made the decision to reduce her hours at the diner and focus more fully on her consulting work. It wasn't an easy decision. The diner had been her safe haven during the most difficult period of her transition, but she recognized that continuing to grow meant taking calculated risks. Her last shift at Miller's Diner fell on a Thursday morning, naturally coinciding with the regular gathering of her 4 veteran friends. They had planned a small celebration to mark her transition, though Sarah had insisted it be kept low-key. When she approached their table that morning, coffee pot in hand for what would be the last time, Frank looked up at her with unmistakable pride. "So," he said, "ready for the next mission?" Sarah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think so," she replied. "Thanks to you guys, I remember who I am now." "Who you always were," Tom corrected gently. "We just helped you remember." As Sarah poured their coffee for the final time in her role as their waitress, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 18 months earlier, she had been a broken veteran, hiding behind silence and routine, trying to disappear into the background of civilian life. Now she was a consultant, a teacher, a community member, and a leader in her own right. The tattoo on her forearm was still there, still bearing witness to her service and sacrifices. But now it felt less like a secret she had to hide, and more like a badge of honor she could wear with pride. The crosshairs and coordinates still marked her as a sniper, but the woman wearing them had evolved into something more complex and complete. "You know," she said to the 4 men as she finished pouring their coffee, "I used to think that military service was about following orders and completing missions. But I've learned that real service is about finding ways to keep making a difference long after you take off the uniform." Pete nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like a true veteran." As Sarah walked away from their table for the last time, the 4 men watched with satisfaction as she moved through the diner with the same precision and awareness she had always displayed, but with a confidence and purpose that had been missing before. She was still their quiet, efficient waitress in many ways, but she was also clearly much more than that. Later that evening, after the diner had closed and Sarah had said her goodbyes to her coworkers, she stood outside in the parking lot looking back at the building that had been her refuge and workplace for nearly 2 years. Miller's Diner had served its purpose in her life, providing stability, routine, and a sense of normal human interaction when she had desperately needed all 3. But now she was ready for something bigger. Tomorrow she would begin her new career as a security consultant, using her unique skills and experience to help others stay safe in an uncertain world. It wasn't the same as being a sniper. The stakes were lower and the methods completely different, but it was still about protection, still about service, still about using her capabilities to make the world a little bit safer. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways her story had unfolded. She had come to this small town trying to disappear, to become invisible, to escape from the weight of her past. Instead, she had found community, purpose, and a path forward that honored both who she had been and who she was becoming. The tattoo on her arm would always be there, a permanent reminder of the 20 confirmed kills that had defined one chapter of her life. But now it was just one chapter among many, and Sarah was finally ready to start writing the next one. In the weeks that followed, people around Millbrook would occasionally ask whatever happened to that quiet waitress who used to work at Miller's Diner. The story they would hear in response would vary depending on who was telling it, but the basic facts were always the same. She had been a decorated veteran who had found her way back to a meaningful life through the support of her community and the wisdom to accept help when it was offered. It was a good story, the kind that reminded people that heroes don't always look like what you might expect, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet places where broken people work to rebuild themselves into something whole again. And every Tuesday and Thursday morning, 4 elderly veterans still gathered at their corner booth in Miller's Diner, drinking coffee and solving the world's problems just like always. But now when they talked about the people they had known and the lives they had touched, they could point to one young woman who had reminded them all that service never really ends. It just finds new forms, and sometimes the most important mission is helping someone remember that they're worth saving.